Okay, so let's just start by spelling out what it is we're actually going to be looking at in the course. So, by and large, we're going to be talking about J.R.R. Tolkien and the texts that influenced him. So we're going to be looking at Anglo-Saxon poetry, in a couple of different forms. We're going to be looking at poems that are called elegies. We're going to be looking at some riddles. As well as a few heroic poems. We're also going to be looking at Icelandic saga material. Now, these Icelandic sagas mix a kind of realistic depiction of life and family squabbles in medieval Iceland with mythological material. So we're going to be concerned with a particular saga called the Volsunga Saga, or the saga of the story of the Volsung family. And we're really only going to be concerned with the first half of it, which is the more mythological half of it, because that's really where the influence on the Lord of the Rings comes from. We're also going to be looking at some poetry in Middle English. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Of which Tolkien himself produced a translation, which I see you have in a paperback form there. And a shorter romance called Sir Orfeo, which is a transposition of the Orpheus myth to medieval England. And then once we're done with this background material, we're going to be dividing Tolkien's own work into a couple of parts. So first, we're going to be looking at some of his critical and theoretical work. In particular, his essay on fairy stories, which is where he spells out a particular theory of fantasy and fantasy writing. We are also going to be looking at two of what he called his great tales. The Fall of Gondolin and The Children of Hurin. We're going to be looking at these before we start looking at the Lord of the Rings proper, in part because this was the material that Tolkien actually started writing first. And the Lord of the Rings is largely born out of... hello.
You might be in the wrong class.
Which class are you looking for?
I thought it was 201, but it might be 211. Is that...
Okay, what's the class you're looking for?
Oh, it's English.
Which English?
American literature.
Okay, then you want 211.
Okay, thank you. All right.
No problem. Gotta get people to be specific. Right, where was it? The Great Tales, right? So these kind of provide a mythology and a kind of background for the Lord of the Rings, right? So that background, all that world-building stuff is done first in hopes of publication. He starts writing The Fall of Gondolin while he's on leave during the First World War. And it's very much influenced by his war experiences. And then we're going to be looking at his best-known works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. We're not going to be looking at the Silmarillion, in part because we're going to be covering much of the same material when we look at the Great Tales. And the Silmarillion is something that is largely just kind of collated from his notes by his son and a Canadian grad student named Guy Gavriel Kay, who later became a well-known fantasy writer. If you've never read Kay's stuff, The Lions of Al-Rassan is actually a really, really good book. Right. So the genre that Tolkien writes in is usually referred to as high fantasy or epic fantasy. Are either of you familiar with these terms? Do either of you know what these mean?
Well, I figure from Epic and just what I know about Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits, a big journey or
Yeah.
some big conflict
Yes.
that you follow, and fantasy being the element in the world that's around it. Rather than science fiction, you got like aliens and stuff. You have fantasy, which is more dwarves, elves,
Yeah.
man, cold.
Mhm. Yeah, and generally what we mean by fantasy, right, is anything that operates in what Tolkien and other writers call a secondary world. Right, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a medieval European style world. In fact, there are a lot of fantasy writers who don't work in a world like that at all. Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea Saga, for example, takes place in a very different, there's magic, but it takes place in a very different kind of world from Middle-earth, right? So a secondary world is a world that operates according to different rules from our own, right? It's an invented world that has its own kind of consistent logic and its own consistent rules, right? So science fiction is usually concerned with pursuing the possible limits of known science or technology, right? If we take this particular technological achievement or this particular scientific idea to its logical conclusion, what do we get? So it's more, the results are fantastic, but it's usually based in real world ideas, right? Fantasy typically isn't. So that's the big distinction between the two. And there are people who would argue with me about this, but for our purposes, I think it'll suffice. Now, when we talk about high fantasy, and I think you were right when you talk about epic, right? Essentially, we're talking about fantasy that is enormous in scope. Right? High fantasy works tend to be relatively long. Right? Big door stoppers. And the secondary worlds in which they take place are large, right? There's a large world, and the heroes are going to explore most of it. Right? These almost never take place in a kind of localized area. They always involve, a quest or a journey, right? They also involve enormous stakes. Right? The survival of a civilization, planet, or way of life and the antagonist is typically incredibly powerful, usually much more powerful than the heroes, right? In a high fantasy, the heroes are usually the underdogs. Whoever represents the forces of good, right? So, the other major feature of high fantasy is its resemblance to a 19th century literary genre called the Bildungsroman. Have either of you ever heard this term before? Okay, you don't spend a lot of time with Germans, huh? So Bildungsroman translates to novel of development. And it traces the protagonist's journey from immaturity to maturity. So essentially, it's a novel in which you watch the protagonist grow up. Now, in high fantasy, you are watching the protagonist grow up in a secondary world full of all kinds of weird monsters and magic and other kinds of bizarre rules. But it's essentially the same sort of thing, right? So you can think of a book like The Lord of the Rings as being almost like something like, James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist, in a secondary world where the heroes are constantly being attacked by orcs rather than by, critics within their own culture, right? So, sorry, like one of the problems with this mask is that I keep getting beer here in my mouth.
I have the same problem.
Yep.
Can't relate.
Yep, it's most unpleasant. So, where was I going with this? So, before we get started, I do just kind of want to know, what drew the two of you to this class? Why did you want to take a class about fantasy literature or about hobbits?
Just love it. For me, I grew up with this.
Uh-huh.
I grew up in a family of nerds, and I fell in love with the world of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and then learned more about Tolkien, but we don't talk about it in high school English classes, and no one really ever talks about it in college. And then I saw this, let's get more into what the meanings are with Tolkien.
Okay, and one thing I'm going to say, about why people never talk about this in high school classes or in college, academically speaking, fantasy has a kind of dodgy reputation. The prevailing attitude in the academy towards fantasy is that it's a kind of immature or childish means of expression, and that most people kind of grow out of it. Now, I disagree, or I wouldn't be teaching a class like this. And I think that, much of the fantasy that gets dismissed is actually doing things that are, from a literary standpoint, more interesting and more mature than the critics of fantasy realize. But we'll be getting into that sort of stuff and how a lot of this serious mythological and historical material gets woven into a high fantasy text over the course of the term. What about you, Nick?
It's a little bit to explain. In the 7th grade,
Uh-huh.
I went to this more liberal type school. It wasn't like a part of the school system. It was some charter school in Florida.
Okay.
And the teacher, we were doing some lesson on fantasy, at least for a little while.
Uh-huh.
And she broke us up by Lexile. So the people with the lowest Lexile had this book to read. People with a mid-level Lexile would read this book. People with the higher Lexile would read this book. I was in that higher Lexile area, and I got to read The Hobbit, which I can't remember where I read it to. I think the first Hobbit book goes all the way to Smaug. I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because in the movies, it breaks off before the Mirkwood, or what is it called, the Mirkwood?
Yeah. So at least the Peter Jackson movies actually they take they take a lot of what's in Tolkien and kind of build this extra stuff onto it that doesn't 3 hours of battle scenes that I don't think actually really add much to the story. But yeah, I think the main goal in The Hobbit is the quest to get to
the mountain.
the quest to Smaug and his mountain, and to get him out of there and get the dwarves back into Erebor, and then to get Bilbo home again, right?
Yeah. So we read it, watched it, we did the whole thing. And since then, fantasy was just kind of an on and off thing. If it was something on TV, I'd definitely watch it. I didn't read too much about it after that.
Yep.
We read Sir Gawain and Britlit 1.
Sure.
I've always been kind of a nerd, just not, a nerd. It's kind of a touchy word to some people around here, actually. Dr. Dahlgren in the middle of one of his lectures is I think nerd is a very misinterpreted kind of word. It shouldn't be this derogatory thing. It should be this thing. And when I saw this course online, I was like, okay, this looks interesting. Most interesting thing I see, one of the only 4,000 level classes I see. So, you know, I mean, I was into it. I'm open to it. I'm very happy to be here.
Good.
I did start a D&D campaign with my friends. It's going to be our first one. And I figure, okay, this will just tack on a little more of what I need to understand, because they're telling me I got to read, like, I got to read this handbook. I got to read
Oh
this
yeah,
handbook,
there's so many handbooks.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I'm a little virgin to this.
It's the
but
library.
We'll see.
Yeah, I've been playing D&D since I was 10, and the company that prints it now, Wizards of the Coast, my college friends and I used to call it Wizards of the Cost, because they kept coming up with more supplements to get you to buy more shit. Well, you know, they first made their name in collectible card games. You know, like the whole point of a game like Magic is to buy more so you have a better deck. But yeah, I mean, you know, and for me, I mean, like a lot of this is just material that I love, you know? And I think that a lot of times, like, we look at that in the academy kind of askance, right? We're suspicious of these kinds of sentimental attachments to texts, because I think we fear that if we love something, we can't be critical of it, right? And by critical, you know, let's just be clear that we don't mean pointing out its flaws, right? By critical, what we mean is doing an informed reading that picks apart and analyzes various features of the text, right? And puts it into a particular frame or context. So, you know, we're not here, like when I say, you know, we're going to be critical, right? We're not here to, you know, to bash The Hobbit and say, oh, it sucks and it's for 8th graders, you know. And, you know, we're here to do some serious analysis on it. And I think that it does actually hold up to serious analysis. Again, or I wouldn't be doing a class like this. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of like the major themes in Tolkien's career are that might influence our readings of the text. So the things that are important to know about John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Known to family and friends as Ronald. Were first, he was a lifelong devout Catholic. Well, by lifelong, I mean like from about the age of 8. But, you know, given that, you know, the man died at the age of 81, that's a pretty damn long time to be a devout Catholic. So people differ over what level of influence this has on his work, right? Whether Middle-earth is in some ways informed by a kind of Christian theology. My argument is that it is actually much closer to a Germanic pagan worldview. But you know, again, this is something that people do debate in Tolkien scholarship, and you know, we'll be getting into this. But remember that this is something that informs his worldview, right?
Well, I can see where they would think more Christian, like because he's Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
and you could think that certain parts of Middle Earth, like the good, like where the elves live, that's heaven.
Sure.
And then like where, you know, Sauron is, that's hell, and then the
Yeah.
middle ground is purgatory. But then you can
Uh-huh.
also break it up even more, looking at the Germanic pagan as, you
Yeah.
know, this is, okay, Germanic. Can I say Valhalla? Would it be like Valhalla?
Yeah, that
You
would
look
be
at it
yeah.
like this is
Mhm.
Valhalla, this
Mhm.
is hell, this is this, this is that.
Well, one thing that we're actually going to get into as we start talking about the way Middle-earth is constructed is that there isn't really a clear afterlife notion expressed in Middle-earth, right? The closest thing, is the Undying Lands.
Yeah.
But, you know, most of the things that live there aren't dead, they're undying, right? And it's not really clear where the souls of men or hobbits or dwarves go when they die, right? So there isn't a clear afterlife concept, and there doesn't appear to be much, if any, organized religion either. So, again, we'll get into this a little bit more deeply, I think, when we start talking about the text in detail. Now, we also will notice a great deal of male bonding in Tolkien's text, or what a cultural critic would refer to as homosociality. Now, one thing to note is that homosociality does not necessarily have any sexual overtones, right? But male friendship seems to be particularly important in Tolkien's text, right? You have the Fellowship is a group of 9 male companions, right? Frodo's closest friend and ally throughout is Samwise, right? That, his most important relationship with another person, arguably, is his relationship with Sam Gamgee. In fact, Frodo is raised without a mother by an elderly uncle. So these male friendships, these male relationships are particularly important to Tolkien. And a lot of this kind of grows out of, again, I don't like to get too biographical in my readings of text. You'll remember my line from this morning, right? I don't give a shit about the author's biography, right? But in Tolkien's case, there seems to be, in his life and his work, a real kind of thirst for male friendship, right? So he's constantly involved with these groups of other men. From his teen years, he is involved in a group called the Tea Club and Barovian Society, or TCBS. There are a bunch of high school friends who adopt this name because they gather together in Barrow's department store in Birmingham to drink tea, which was something that was technically not allowed by their school. So, this act of rebelliousness. They would meet to do things like, read texts that were outside of the curriculum and write plays and put on little theatricals together and things like that. So he's also an officer in the British Army in World War I. So, trench camaraderie. Is another big thing that informs his worldview. And reflecting his need for these kinds of groups and societies, he is also, as an adult, a member of a loose grouping of British fantasy writers based around Oxford called the Inklings. And this group includes writers like C.S. Lewis, the Narnia guy, Charles Williams, and Owen Barfield. Two other environmental influences are also important. So, Tolkien is born in a city called Bloemfontein in what was then called the Orange Free State. It was the Dutch-controlled part of what's now South Africa. But his family was British, and he came to England as a toddler and never went back to South Africa. In fact, his father died before he could return with the rest of the family to Britain. So, from the age of about 3, he never saw his father again. When they came to England, his mother, Muriel, moved the family to a town outside of Birmingham called Sarehole Mill. And Sarehole Mill is it's a little English country village, or was. And Tolkien's memories of this place are idyllic. right? He remembers, the trees and having, these kind of wild, overgrown places to explore. And it was just he regarded as a kind of like beautiful balance between human settlement and nature. And, some of these might have been the genuine impressions of a child, and some of these might have been an adult reading back ideas that were common in British culture around the beginning of World War I onto childhood. So when Tolkien is finishing his university education and enlisting in the British Army, the primary mode of literary expression in Britain is what's called Georgian poetry.
And this is like early 20th century?
Yeah, this would be like kind of like roughly 1912 to about 1916. Georgian poetry doesn't survive the war for reasons that'll become obvious when we define what it is, right? So, Georgian poetry is based on a kind of idealization of rural England, right? These pastoral landscapes of free and happy people. It's intensely nationalistic. And it has an almost pagan pantheist kind of ethos to it. Authors that wrote in this mode would be people like Rupert Brooke, for example. And who's the other? I can't think of the other important guy's name off the top of my head. I didn't write it down. But yeah, if you look up Rupert Brooke and some of Rupert Brooke's poetry, you'll get a good sense of what this stuff looks like. Now, the Georgian poets were very much interested in promoting this kind of myth of England. As a green and pleasant land that was to be protected not only from invading forces, but from encroaching industrialization and other such modern viciousness and inconvenience. Now, from Sarehole Mill, Tolkien's family moved when he was about 8 years old into the city of Birmingham. Birmingham is also where Black Sabbath and Judas Priest come from. Pardon?
And Peaky Blinders.
Okay, and Peaky Blinders, yeah. But in historical terms, it's most important for being England's beating industrial heart for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, right? Birmingham was a big factory town. Steel mills in particular.
So it's like the Detroit of England, sort
in
of?
a way. And it goes into a similar kind of decline as globalization takes hold, yeah. But this would be well after Tolkien's time. But yeah, so he goes from the rural paradise of Sarehole Mill to the industrial hell or purgatory of Birmingham. And we'll see this dichotomy shape his work as well, right? We'll see in works like The Lord of the Rings, the good and the pure, the places to be defended, are not necessarily wild places, because those are also dangerous, but these kind of semi-wild places, these kind of pastoral places, full of yeoman farmers, like Bree or the Shire, right? These are the ideal kinds of places. And they're, the people of Bree and the Hobbits of the Shire are kind of Tolkien's image of rural English people, right? Not terribly educated, smart on their own ground, not interested in much that goes on beyond the borders of their village, right? But living happy, peaceful lives there.
I would add a desk just like this last semester too. Just love to make noise.
Oh yeah, you got the wobbly one. I think that a lot of them are wobbly ones. Now, Birmingham, however, was not entirely without charm for Tolkien. And I think there's one thing that the city did have going for it was it had a good art museum and a very good collection of what's called pre-Raphaelite art. Do any of you know do either of you know who or what the pre-Raphaelites were?
The pro or the pre?
Pre-Raphaelites.
All I
Okay.
can think of is Raphael.
Raphael the painter? Okay, good. Not Raphael the Ninja Turtle. I'm glad that that's what you thought of. So let me just quickly pull up some images and I'll show you what pre-Raphaelite painting looks like. And you tell me what kinds of themes we see here that might be attractive to someone like Tolkien. You also have probably seen some of these paintings, even if you didn't know they were pre-Raphaelite paintings or anything about the painters.
They have a lot of plants in them.
They do.
I read something last night. I wasn't even looking for it. It just popped up.
Uh-huh.
And it said that people didn't like going on walks with Tolkien because we would stand there for like 20 minutes discussing a tree.
Yeah, he loved trees.
Or,
Mhm.
you couldn't go out to his greenhouse with him because he would spend 30 minutes saying,
Yeah.
lecturing about a flower.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's where the habits of the professor and the nature enthusiast kind of come together. And we'll see that pre-Raphaelite painting not only gives Tolkien an influence in terms of content, but also in terms of visual vocabulary, right? We're going to see certain visual elements expressed in these paintings that come out particularly in Tolkien's depiction of women. So this is a scene from Thomas Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, painted by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, in which Sir Galahad, Sir Bors, and Sir Percival are fed from the Holy Grail. So take a minute, take it in, give it a look. We'll move on to another painting. This is a painting by John William Waterhouse called The Lady of Shalott. And here we see all of that lush vegetation you were talking about, right? What else do we notice that's consistent between these two paintings so far?
The women are redheads.
Okay, the women are redheads. Yeah, what else do you notice about their hair?
It's long.
It's long and heavy and there's lots of it, right?
And it's not braided, it's free flowing.
Yeah, long, free-flowing hair. We're going to see a lot of this in the way Tolkien describes women, right? A lot of the female characters will be described as having this kind of long, flowing hair. Galadriel in particular, right? Now, it's also true that there are relatively few female characters in Tolkien, right? Those that are in the books are actually quite important. Again, notably Galadriel and Éowyn. Yeah, there aren't a lot of them.
Not a lot of ladies there.
No, not so much. Yeah, it is, as we noted, a very masculine world.
But also giving credit that women, there are women in his story. They're
Mhm.
not weak, windy little creatures. They're very
No.
strong and powerful.
Yeah, I wouldn't fuck with Galadriel. No. I mean, we do get a sense that she is probably the oldest and most powerful living being in Middle Earth, right? But yeah, so what else do we notice is consistent between these two paintings? What other features do these two paintings share?
The tapestries. seem to be around the same. They look relatively the same. It's at least the same colors: red, yellow.
Yeah, lots of
Yeah.
reds and golds and
Yeah,
creams.
yeah, very similar color schemes. And what about thematically? Just in terms of like what's depicted in the painting, like what kind of story elements are we getting here? Like what kind of story is being told here? What era would we set the story in?
Arthurian.
Yeah, this is all very Arthurian, right? Very medieval. Speaking of which, this is another Arthurian scene painted by Edward Burne-Jones, The Beguiling of Merlin, where we have the sorceress Nimue. She's captured Merlin in a hawthorn bush because he won't stop trying to have sex with her. And she is casting a spell on him from this book to try to seal him up in a cave, right?
I thought it was Morgana that got him. I didn't realize it was Nimue.
Well, you know, both of those answers are correct because the Arthurian corpus is so large and there are so many variant stories from different eras, right? So yeah, you know, the sorceress who captures Merlin has a number of different names, right? But I think part of the point here is that there's this visual art present in Birmingham in Tolkien's childhood that tells these kinds of medieval fantasy stories that can kind of give fire to a kid's imagination, right? Now, along similar lines, I think we also have to talk a little bit about Tolkien's professional work. And how that shapes his worldview and the worldview expressed in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings particularly. So he is a professor for most of his working career, for most of his working life, of English language and literature. First at Leeds University, and then at Oxford. So his specialty, or at least his method, is called philology. Do either of you know what philology is?
Translates to love of language.
Love of language, yeah, or love of study, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was completely wrong. Studying philosophy.
Yeah, philology actually has little to do with philosophy and everything to do with language. Right? So a philologist is primarily concerned with tracing the development and history of languages. After the war, Tolkien's first job, before he was appointed professor at Leeds University, was working on what would become the Oxford English Dictionary as a researcher. Right? So he was, literally researching the history of English words. And much of his scholarly work is concerned with tracing the development of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English in literature. Now, some of this interest grew out of a hobby that he developed as a teenager of inventing languages. So the way the story of the Genesis of Middle-earth goes is that it began with Tolkien's construction of these fictional Elvish languages. Sindarin, which was based on Welsh, and Quenya, which he based on Finnish. And once he had started developing these languages, he started building a mythology to go along with these languages that he'd invented. Right? It's like, okay, well, who speaks these languages, what sort of people would they be. And because he's been reading medieval Welsh literature and the old Finnish and the Finnish epics, the Kalevala, he decides, well, these are like the inhabitants of a kind of epic, chivalric romance kind of universe, right? So he's combining elements of medieval literature with elements of more medieval literature, with also stuff borrowed from the modern world. And his most famous academic work is an essay called Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, which argues not only for Beowulf as a poem that expresses a particular worldview that is typical of Germanic paganism, but also as a literary masterpiece in its own right. Prior to that, scholars of Anglo-Saxon had regarded Beowulf much the way a lot of scholars today regard the Lord of the Rings, right? They kind of kept it at arm's length. They thought it was a kind of flawed, immature fantasy from which we could learn things about the development of Anglo-Saxon language, but that as a poem wasn't worth studying at all, mostly because of the silly monsters. Tolkien's argument is that the monsters are actually the whole point of the poem, and that they're actually what makes it interesting. He also argues that this is one of the clearest expressions we get from the Middle Ages, or the early Middle Ages, of a distinct Anglo-Saxon worldview, right? Now, it's mixed with developing Christian ideas, but the basic notion that he draws from it is that idea of kind of doom or fate. Right. There's a notion common to Germanic pagan cultures that everyone's fate is already set, and there's really nothing you can do to avert it. So you may as well meet whatever challenges come your way with everything you've got, because if you're fated to die, you're going to die anyway. Now, the other notion that informs this worldview is that evil will ultimately triumph. You can kind of put the forces of entropy and chaos at bay for a little while, but each victory is a temporary victory. And eventually, the world will end. The Fenris wolf will swallow Odin. The Midgard serpent will squeeze the earth, and it'll, erupt, and everything's going to fall apart, right?
So that Norse mythology is sort of shared with the same Germanic peoples and the Anglo-Saxons that all fate is pretty much in that. So that entire area of like northern and western Europe is going to say, more or less, is going to have the same message of we're doomed, face every challenge.
Yeah. Now the Anglo-Saxons are Christianized earlier than the Vikings, but they're coming from the same cultural root. Right, where was I going? What was I saying? Okay, yeah, so the fact that evil is going to triumph, though, right, doesn't mean that you should stop fighting. It's still worth it to try to put that triumph off a little bit longer, right? They're still going to win, but you prove yourself through the way you face up to that hopelessness. Right, and that's kind of what a hero does, is pit himself against these impossible odds. Throw the dice and hope he wins. So it is an ethos of courage in the face of hopelessness. So I feel like that should give us enough background material to go on here. You haven't read anything for the course yet, so, you know, there's not much more really to talk about. I've given you the assignment up here. It's on the syllabus, and I've also written it up here on the board, right? So I want you to read the two elegies that are in the earliest English poems volume, The Wanderer and the Seafarer, and also read the riddles. Oh, and I do have some guide questions to give you as well to help you through these. If I can figure out where the hell I saved them. There we go. You know, I always come into the room early with the intention of getting everything set up, and there are always things I forget to do. So, do either of you have any questions? Okay. So, here are my questions to you to help you through the reading. I'll give you each a rag to wipe down your workstation. And we'll see you on Monday to talk about Anglo-Saxon poetry.
What is the last one on that list? It says and something
Riddles.
else. Just riddles?
Riddles.
Okay.
Yep.
Can I take a picture of that?
I'd rather you write it down because if I find that just the act of writing it down actually helps you mentally engage a little bit.